Glad to see you all here today. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second session of the inaugural History of Medicine Week. This session is titled Beyond the Annual Meeting and History in Therapeutic Spaces. My name is Adam Biggs, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I also serve as the chair of the Education and Outreach Committee for the American Association for the History of Medicine, and I'm going to be your host and moderator today. History of Medicine Week is the product of several conversations that took place in committee and with the AAHM Council, and is part of our organization's larger mission to build meaningful connections between the history of medicine and communities that extend beyond our familiar academic networks. The theme for this week is broader audiences, meaningful engagement, and that's the subject our panelists will be speaking to today. Before we get started, I'll just say, glad to see you all here. And as the conversation is going on, if you'd like to put in questions in the Q&A function on your screens, feel free to do that. And then when we get to the discussion part of our session, we will address as many of them as we can. So what I'll do is I'll just start by introducing each one of our panelists individually. They're going to talk for 5 minutes, and then we'll do that for each panelist. And at the end of their 3 talks, we will open it up for discussion and dialogue. So great to have you all here. And we're going to start with Katie Deani. Katie is the Director of Library Services and Archives at Children's Mercy, Kansas City. She's worked in public, academic, specialized, and medical libraries. And before becoming a librarian, she was a science journalist for the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer on PBS. Katie was part of a great poster session that went on at our annual meeting at Kansas City. So we're really enthusiastic to have her here.
Thanks, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here. So first of all, I want to thank you for everyone for taking the time to listen. I am not a historian. I will open that up. I am true and a librarian, so the dissemination of information. But I was asked as we basically took over the archives at Children's Mercy Kansas City and right at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the idea of building those connections and those kind of aha moments for those opportunities to spread the word about the history. So Children's Mercy Kansas City was founded in 1897 by 2 sisters, a surgeon and a dentist. We call them the Berry sisters affectionately. And we play a unique role in the library because we, as I said, we inherited the archives back in 2020. Before it was amateur historians who were handling the archives, a few nurses who just had a passion for it. So we are still figuring out what we have in the archives. And as we are figuring out what we have in the archives, it's been a long, arduous process to see what physically we have, papers, and then 3D objects as well. And as we were starting to take this over, we got a call from the CEO's office saying, hey, it's the 125th anniversary coming up. What do we have? How can we celebrate the 125th? We were physically in the archives, which is basically was a storage unit offsite, digging through things when we got that call. Thankfully, I have 2 archivists, librarians on staff, so they know what they're doing and they will tell me what to do. So we were looking for the idea of finding that story. Yes, we have a rich story from the 2 sisters who founded this back in 1897, who hit lots of barriers, but we wanted for that 125th anniversary, but as we were looking through all the information, we found a few other stories, one specifically that we thought was unique and a story that could connect with a broader audience, and that was topical and just really pretty amazing and unique. So we figured out that we identified through papers and other things, there was a friendship between Dr. Catherine Berry Richardson, who was the surgeon, one of the sisters, who also was a friend of Dr. John Perry, who was one of the first African-American doctors in the Kansas City area. And he founded the Wheatley Provident Hospital, which was the first private hospital to serve Black patients in Kansas City. So through this unique friendship that we were able to identify, they worked together and they were able to establish what they called the Mercy Model Ward in 1923. And that was the first pediatric training clinic in the nation for Black doctors. So before, it was kind of considered like a fellowship. If you think about it now, that idea of the fellowship, they came to Kansas City. They came everywhere from Boston, from Atlanta, from San Francisco to train in Kansas City for pediatrics, for that training center. So that was the story we wanted to tell. We built on our connections in the library. So we worked with our institution's Office of Equity and Diversity, and we said, hey, Black History Month's coming up. We have really like an interesting exhibit that we can build. And we partnered with them. So that building on that connection to find that unique story. We did the open house during Black History Month. We partnered with them. And then this is sort of like that sort of organic building connections that we talk about is one of the doctors who attended our exhibit in our open house. She sits on the Kansas City Mayor's Commission on Reparations. So she came down to our exhibit. She took a huge interest in it. And then a week later, she reached out to us and said, hey, could you guys present to, there's a group coming from the United Nations Black Audit Project, so which is an initiative aimed at assessing the well-being of African Americans across the country, and they're reporting up to the United Nations. And they were coming to Kansas City to visit. Then they came and we gave 3-hour tour to them, and we were just answering questions and telling about the rich history of African American pediatric care in the Kansas City area. So I guess my takeaway from this would be, one, find that unique story that you think will connect to the broader audience, that will make people curious, that's topical, that is also unique. And then be willing to build those connections and form those connections to who knows who's going to read or talk to you, to put us in touch with that broader audience that now is going to be included in the United Nations report. So you never know what's going to happen. So that unique story, and then build those connections, and always kind of have that idea that those opportunities, you never know when they're going to happen.
Jonathan Perry also has that fascinating autobiography, 40 Chords of Wood, that talks about, yeah, how like he struggled to kind of connect with people also when he first became a physician. So thank you very much for that. Lots of to talk about in our discussion. Okay, good. So our second presenter for today is Sarah Nairmore. Sarah is an assistant professor of history in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at Northwest Missouri State University. She is an historian of medicine and the early American Republic with an interest in the intersections of science, medicine, and politics. Her first book, Benjamin Rush, Civic Health and Human Illness in the Early American Republic, explores the way in which Benjamin Rush and his students promoted medical theories they believed were best suited to the new republic. Sarah is also the regional coordinator for National History Day in Northwest Missouri and chair of the Committee on Education and Engagement for the History of Science Society. So my fellow servant on outreach committees.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Adam. And I feel like I need to apologize to you and everyone who has to introduce me about having such a long title for my book. Just trying to get all of the ideas in there. But no, thank you so much for inviting me. As your sort of HSS counterpart, I'm just genuinely so impressed by everything that's happened with History of Medicine Week, because I know how hard it is to do this, which is what I'm planning to talk a little bit about. So when asked to consider this sort of question about outreach, how do we engage with other audiences, honestly, I think like many people, my first sort of reaction was like, do I do that? And then I was taking notes and realized that I do this all the time, both in the classroom, through HSS, through National History Day. So rather than having a nice sort of neat single story like Katie, I'm going to break things down into a couple tidbits and a couple sort of like little bites of how this works, or how I think I'm contributing to this, not as an expert, but just as a practitioner trying to do my best. So I don't really want to present myself as like, here is exactly how to do outreach. This is just some stuff I've been thinking about and trying to get beyond the regular audience. So I'm going to sort of divide it into like things I think I do and things I think I see, and then wrap up with the big challenges. So in terms of what I do and what I think many people on the call do, as a reminder, probably our biggest opportunity to talk about history of medicine is in our classrooms, reaching out to students who may or may not be terribly interested. I'm on a U.S. history line. I'm not hired as a historian of medicine, but I do get the chance to bring some history of medicine into those classes, as well as now I've designed a couple of history of medicine, history of science courses. And the thing that I've realized is probably the thing that a lot of us either have gotten beyond or hope doesn't exist anymore, which really is still, at least for our students, I find this sort of the two cultures problem. I still have students coming to me basically saying, I don't know if I can take a history of science class. I'm not a science kid. I'm not a science person, not a math person. Am I going to be able to handle this? And I get the same things from students in survey classes who are kind of like, this is not my thing. Like, I'm this other type of person. I think inherently, like many of us who are on the call, probably as historians of medicine or interested in history of medicine, yeah, we don't see that divide. We can put a foot in both of those worlds or see how they're kind of not really true. But they still very much are with students and trying to help bridge those gaps by bringing those history of medicine stories into regular survey classes. And hopefully this semester, next semester, I'm teaching history of American science for the second time and trying to, we'll see if it works, but the idea of trying to help reduce the student anxiety about science and scientific primary sources by focusing on popular science. So we're actually going to do a history of American science through popular science. So starting with my wheelhouse with Benjamin Rush, who was actively publishing in newspapers and pamphlets and did not like just talking to doctors, which was interesting. So that's, one thing that's like very small. I'm also the co-coordinator for National History Day here. For those of you who don't know about National History Day, and I'll be really quick. National History Day is basically like science fair for history. So we get about 200 middle and high school students coming to our campus, presenting their own original research. And it is an opportunity to have direct contact with students, encourage their interests, many of which are science, technology, medicine topics, particularly when it's students who are kind of forced to do something by their teachers. So they'll sometimes find something that they're interested in. And it's an especially good chance to contact teachers out in our community. So we're pulling from a predominantly pretty rural area. I am not far from Katy and Kansas City, but Kansas City does not fall into our region. So we are the rural areas north and west of the city. So that's an important opportunity just to make those contacts, be able to talk to teachers, be able to send and share material and outreach, which is also something that we've been trying to do a little bit with HSS. We'll see how that goes. So those are some of the things that I have done. As for what I've watched and encouraged, trying to be that connecting person, I'm not sure I've been the best at it, but trying to like make those connections and encourage people has really been my role with HSS, as sort of basically Adam's spot. We do two big things every year. We select the Hazen Prize for Education, and then we put on the Elizabeth Paris lecture or event, depending on which year, which is supposed to be a public event. I'll start with Paris because this is both, I think, the best outreach that we've probably done consistently and also the biggest challenge in trying to find a meaningful venue, a meaningful speaker or set of speakers, and then actually getting the public to attend when you're doing this in a city where you probably don't live. And for any of you who are HSS members, you know that our meeting in November will be in Mexico. So also trying to work across national boundaries and linguistic boundaries, particularly since this is, supposed to be for the public. And we are dealing with a mostly Anglophone organization trying to put on an event mostly in Spanish. There are challenges, and this is again why forming those relationships is so important. I think in my experience, the best events that we put on are ones where we were able to work with institutions that already had a really good handle on their communities and ongoing programming that we could assist in or partner with. So when we were in Chicago, we had an event at the Adler Planetarium on their free night for Chicago and Illinois residents. So we could reach a broader audience, and especially an audience focused on the city of Chicago or in local areas rather than like tourists coming in, which meant we reached a more sort of diverse group with our panel discussions. And then in Portland last year, we worked with the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, where they have a sort of bi-monthly science pub series, a series of popular science lectures mainly for adults at an institution that's mainly for children. So unfortunately, because science museums are great, but they were trying to expand people who were coming in to see them. They were happy to allow us basically to pick the speaker for one of those series. So those partnerships are so incredibly useful and important because so many of us, myself included, I'm not trained to do this. It's not my main job. And I just, yeah, want to extend a note of trying to make those connections, asking for help when you need to, because so many of us have so many other things piling on our plates at the same time.
It's a fabulous story, and I think you gave us a lot to sort of connect with on there. But I just want to also amplify the point that you started with, which is to say, I think it's probably more beneficial for us to sort of orient ourselves toward experimentation rather than sort of performative expertise in these kind of endeavors, right? That it sort of takes trial and error to kind of actually make these kind of things work. That's great. I'll introduce Johanna and then we will move to our conversation. So our third speaker for today is Johanna Schoen. Johanna is a professor in the Department of History at Rutgers University. Her major interests include the history of women in medicine, the history of reproductive rights, and the history of sexuality. The work on her first book, Choice and Coercion, brought the history of eugenic sterilization in North Carolina to light and led to an official apology by the governor, along with restitution paid to North Carolina's sterilization victims. Her second book, Abortion After Roe, won the AAHM's Welsh Medal for Best Book in the Field and is as relevant now as ever. And this past spring, she also delivered the Garrison Lecture at the annual meeting in Kansas City. In her spare time, Johanna volunteers at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where she is a member of the Patient and Family Advisory Council for Quality and the Ethics Committee, and works on improving end-of-life conversations between clinicians, patients, and caregivers. Great to have you, Johanna.
Thank you, Adam, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for attending. I'm so psyched that we're doing this and that so many people are here. So our charge was to talk a little bit about what we did in terms of public outreach and our experience with it. I feel like I started going into public outreach actually as I was writing the book about birth control, sterilization, and abortion. And part of the reason I started is that as I was revising the dissertation into a book manuscript, the state of Virginia had just apologized for its eugenic sterilization program. And I was thinking to myself, well, if the state of Virginia apologizes, the state of North Carolina should also apologize. And contacted the Raleigh News and Observer to make them aware of the fact that North Carolina had a similar program as Virginia, and in fact more extensive. And they really weren't particularly interested. They did like a little story in some back page, and I let it go. But I think that attempt to do an initial outreach meant that a year or two later, I got contacted by a journalist team from the Winston-Salem Journal, and they wanted to do a big story, i.e. multi-pieces extended over an entire week with, 3 or 4 journalists about this history. And I won't go into the details of the negotiations, but I did eventually decide to open my, at that point, unpublished research findings to that team. And they basically did this larger story that then culminated in an apology by the governor, ironically, not to sterilization victims, but to the journalist team, and eventually into a longer debate about restitution payments. And so what that meant is that via that kind of venue, I started having a lot of interactions with journalists. There were a lot of stories over the following years. And then as I started writing my second book about the history of legal abortion, that kind of continued because by that time, abortion was always in the news. And, once you talk to one journalist, other people call. I had also, for the second book, joined the professional organization of abortion providers, the National Abortion Federation, because when I started research on that book, the history of abortion was not discoverable in an archive. There were no archival sources. And I basically started going to the NAF meetings to ask any abortion provider who looked like they were 70 or older, or maybe a little younger, to give their papers to an archive, and would they mind if I interviewed them. And so that meant that I also started talking to clinicians, and I talked to clinicians about their history and what their history can tell us, both in the National Abortion Federation and then in other professional organizations and meetings that had to do with reproductive health and reproductive politics. I will say, I'm going to jump ahead and then double back for a second, that after the Dobbs decision, I stopped doing this. And I stopped doing this partly because I was so disgusted and I was so cynical about the politics that I didn't think I had anything constructive to say when journalists called. And I was also just kind of getting sick of it. And by that time, there were so many younger scholars working who I assumed were less cynical than I was and would be more constructive in what they were going to say to the press, that I didn't want to do it anymore. So I basically didn't answer any kind of calls, which also meant that, like at some point right after Dobbs, the French government called and wanted me to come to Paris and talk to, I don't know, somebody. I didn't feel like it. And I still remember friends saying, you passed up a free trip to France. But, it's exhausting to do this kind of work and it costs a lot of time. And I was like, I go to France as a tourist, but I really didn't want to do this. So I just basically let it go. I did do some background work. So when people called and they were working on longer pieces and they didn't necessarily want to quote me, but they wanted background information on X, Y, and Z, those were the conversations I actually really enjoyed. And those were the conversations where I didn't have to pay close attention to speaking in full sentences and being coherent and not being sarcastic, because it was background. And so those I have continued to do. And I also at some point wrote a couple briefs for several of the lawsuits that were going on around the country. One of the things that I think is really important when you start doing this kind of work is that you're really clear on the fact that it costs a lot of time. And really that if you want to talk to the press, you have to be spiffy and you have to prepare, because if you don't, then it just doesn't work. And it is something that universities don't necessarily recognize. I was never dependent on my university recognizing that I did this public work, because I was also doing all the other things we're supposed to do for promotion. And in fact, I wasn't very good in terms of saving the things that I had given interviews to that were being published. So if you do this, you should be better about it than I was. But I also didn't really need to have all of that as a record. But you need to be aware that it is a total time suck, and that as you appear in one newspaper once or twice, everybody will start to call until you no longer respond when they stop. So be clear that at some point you might want to step away, and that's fine. There are other people who can do this work. You don't have to do it. I did a couple other things. At some point, I was for 3 years director of the Rutgers Center for Historical Analysis, and I was co-directing with my colleague Kim Mutcherson a seminar on life and death. And when I started that, I decided that I wanted to do some podcasts. And that was partly because I wanted to be able to bring the discussions that we had as part of that seminar to a general public. And it was partly because I was super naive and didn't understand how much time it costs to do a podcast. We do have undergraduate research assistants who I was able to hire to help me do it. Some were better than others. But I was able to produce maybe 12 or 15 podcasts that I still regularly use for teaching on a regular basis. Not all of them, but some. And actually, if you're interested in them, email me and I will pass them on. And there's some really fascinating ones that are helpful for the history of medicine. And then the last thing I have done, and I have actually just stepped away from, partly comes out of volunteer work I did. So I do have to say that as much as there is a political need for volunteer work in the reproductive space, I never volunteered in that space, because I cannot write and do intellectual thinking about a topic where I also volunteer. It's just overkill. I just can't emotionally deal with that. But at some point, I had a partner who got diagnosed with cancer and then eventually died. And she was treated at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And after she died, I joined the Patient and Family Advisory Council, which is basically the interest groups of patients and caregivers. That was in early 2017. And I'm still a member of that group. I have kind of stepped away at the beginning of the year, but in 2022 and 2023, I was co-chair of that group. And I did find that the skills that I had basically learned as a result of an academic came in really handy, working in PFAC and working with clinicians in terms of trying to improve, especially end-of-life care at Sloan Kettering. In particular, for instance, a colleague and I organized the very first national symposium of members of patient and family advisory councils in cancer centers around the country last fall. And I was happy to volunteer for that because I had organized conferences before. And many of the other PFAC members didn't really feel comfortable doing that kind of work. And for me, that's a second nature. I've done it. I know how to do it. And so that was really interesting and really fun to do, and something that was incredibly rewarding. I have since stepped back because I have, in the meantime, also gotten slightly cynical about what we can change in the clinical setting. But that also had to do with the fact that I stepped off as my role in co-chair and decided to refocus my energies on writing my last book. So part of my professional interests and my volunteer interests started diverging.
No, that was great, Johanna. I mean, I think, and I actually feel like you take us right into like a question that maybe we can, address to the entire panel, which is to say, and I want to sort of start with this like sense of maybe of cynicism that you kind of felt, right? And I'm just maybe this speaks a little bit also to what Sarah kind of described as like the two culture maybe problem in some ways. But I'm just kind of wondering, was there some sense that somehow the way we kind of think about history or the way we conceptualize history doesn't always translate in meaningful ways that can have a transformative sort of impact on these different types of spaces, right? So are there times when, for example, maybe working with journalists, you feel perhaps that they're not conveying the message that you're really trying to send, or that in these different kind of spaces outside of, let's just say, for academia, that it's not always clear that we're able to kind of move in ways that are effective?
Yeah, I mean, as it had to do with the work that I was doing with journalists, really is related to the politics of abortion and reproductive health in this country. Okay. I think Dobbs was such a setback in terms of what I predicted and expected for the longest time until Trump came into office. I always said they're never going to overturn Roe. And then, of course, that did happen. So I think it came out of that very particular political moment. And also my kind of feelings about the level of misogyny that really pervades the reproductive politics field and politics in this country. So that particularly didn't help. I think as it relates to changing clinical care, I do think that there's a time when one has invested a number of years doing some work and when it's good to take a break. And so I felt that particularly at MSK, and I felt that also a little bit in the clinical spaces that had to do with reproductive politics, although those I moved out of because I started working on neonatal intensive care units. And I find like I just don't have the bandwidth to continue all the things I did before and then also work on something new. I like also having a private life and spending time not engaging in all of these political issues, right? But to go and play pickleball or do any of these age-appropriate things that I started doing. So there are somewhat overlapping. I mean, I think one of the things that I did realize is that especially a space like Sloan Kettering, they provide important services. I think it's super important that former caregivers and patients are involved in shaping and having a voice. But I also did recognize that there are certain limits and that we can push for certain things and have certain initiatives, and they will just never happen. Or if they happen, they don't happen in 7 years. They maybe happen in 20 years.
I appreciate that, because that's a very sobering, I want to say, look at how we should perceive what kind of interventions we can expect to make in the careers that we have and in the lifespans that we have. And it also sort of speaks to the need for us to be conscientious of our own human limitations and needs, which is to say, we need to go play pickleball. We need to have time for respite. We need to have time to kind of relax and sort of enjoy, the time we have as well. Sarah and Katie, I guess I'm wondering, in that same kind of vein, are there ways that you have perhaps found yourselves cynical about the prospects of what kind of transformative impact history can have in these respective spaces? Are there things that maybe have led you to doubt?
I mean, I think mostly for me personally, it's just been the limitations of what I can do while trying to have some semblance of work-life balance and a healthy, positive relationship with history. Because, trying to keep making my research something that I get excited about. And I'm also starting a new project. So Johanna, I thank you for that insight of starting something new really drains you for other things, because a lot of my brain wants to just go on to this new thing. But again, for me, reaching out for help has been useful just for the nuts and bolts of things. Like I mentioned, I am now head of National History Day. I am now splitting that responsibility with somebody else in my department, which I'm really grateful for. I know this might not seem super evident since I'm on a virtual panel right now, but I'm more of the introverted type. I get really drained with all of the organizing of different people. So being able to move all of the troubleshooting communications to somebody else has been very helpful. And I can handle the logistics. That's fine. Yeah, I think part of it, I guess, thinking of what we can actually do, maybe, and I'm not sure how to put this into motion. And Katie, maybe you have ideas or others, and I will stop. But I think thinking about not just what we can sort of bring to a public space or to the world beyond the academy, but thinking about what actually other people, other professions want from us. Not that we have to conform to other people's expectations, but I think it's important to think about what a journalist, what a UN commission, what museum goers, what high school students actually think history is useful for, and try to meet them halfway.
And so this is something that I want to say people have kind of said in medical schools, but I'm also kind of wondering what your experience with this has been, which is to say that sometimes there's a tax with talking about science, right? There's maybe anxieties that get sort of brought into the picture, but sometimes there's also anxieties or something that turns people off when you say you're talking about history. And so in some spaces, it's easier to sort of introduce history through the lens of something like science and technology studies, as opposed to say, well, this is an endeavor that is historical. And I guess I'm kind of wondering, in the work that you kind of do with National History Day, do you find the same kind of aversions that go with students who are kind of have anxieties about either what science requires or about what history requires?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely, again, I think what we're trying to do more of is helps provide some of those tools about what doing history is rather than just learning history. That's the big sort of jump, and realizing that it's not just sort of aligning fact or presenting the one version of truth, which does sort of, I mean, I like to talk about it sometimes as being science not that we're exactly the same, but there's a lot more sort of curiosity and exploration when you are doing history than I think particularly a lot of grade school students assume, because it's not how it's presented. I think History Day is a really good way to get them to think about that, about curiosity. I don't think we talk enough about curiosity in education in general. That's sort of a core value I've been trying to bring to a lot of things lately.
I love that idea. I mean, I think, and this sort of came up yesterday, and maybe it's just because it's something that I've been stuck on for a while, but this distinction between sort of performing expertise versus engaging our curiosities and our questions, and sort of using that as, that process of exploration and experimentation as being sort of the root of education and learning, as opposed to demonstrating that you have already acquired or learned something. Katie, what about that with you? Do you find, I guess, questions about either science or questions about history sort of being impediments at times in the spaces where you're working?
We have the opportunity. We teach to residents, we teach to new fellows, we teach to nurses. So every single opportunity that we have before we teach them how to do a PubMed search, we take that opportunity to do that connection for a little bit of the history and the archives of the institution where they are. And I think sometimes when we do, especially one-on-one sessions with new residents who are rotating through Children's Mercy, some of them are actually more drawn to the history of it. And we have maybe 30 minutes with residents because they're just chock full of, all the information that they need to learn. But I mean, I recently had a conversation that went on for an hour with someone who just came off of a night rotation, and he was very interested in the history and like in the broader of Kansas City of Children's Mercy. So those kinds of information. So I'm a hustler at heart. So I will go and every opportunity try and jam you with more information than you need. It's the librarian in me as well, just the oversharing. But with that, every opportunity, we talk like elevator pitches that you have to have. Hey, we have an archives. Hey, it's a really rich history. Hey, you should come check us out, either the digital or the physical exhibit. So I think just creating that opportunity to explore and find those people who are curious, Sarah, who have that curiosity, like they're like, ooh, and just taking the time to really form that connection with them is very helpful, because you never know when they're going to come back and be like, actually, I'm throwing away my medicine degree. I'm going to become a historian instead. Who knows? So
I quit being pre-vet to do this.
So it threw away a medicine degree of sorts. So Katie, though, but you mentioned like one of the biggest obstacles was when you started that the archive was in disarray.
Yes.
And I'm kind of wondering, were there other sort of obstacles that you found yourself sort of encountering along the way, that either whether it was resistance of different sorts or other things that stood out to you?
And I think there were a few passionate people who have been collecting things, but the idea, because there was no true historian or archivist on staff, that it was always kind of pushed to the wayside. So fighting for a budget has been big. The cost of archival materials, the cost of an institutional repository, things like that. So to be on that forefront, because we are a hospital, we are a clinical establishment, and that is the sole purpose, is to take care of the kids of Kansas City. But this is a way for us to make that connection. So I have to make that, when I have to go in for budget talks, make that pitch to make sure that that's a line item that we can grow the archives and really preserve the history.
And is that sort of the most, I want to say, compelling sort of argument that you're able to make, is that we need to grow the history of it, that the history of it is valuable? Or what is it that moves the meter with the budget committee?
It's that, and then also what we were able to do for the 125th anniversary, and say the 150th is not far from here. And if you guys want a 150th anniversary, we need to have all that, like the archives needs to be organized and discoverable. So, yep.
And so could you talk a little bit about like what it sounded like there was an enthusiastic reception for the work that you all did for the 125th, and it's the 250th anniversary at RPI. And so I think this month our archivist has been inundated with similar kind of requests. And I'm wondering if you could just sort of talk about like the impact you felt it had.
I think it's just what we were able to pull together and find, we found one thing that was like the original mold of the nursing cap for Children's Mercy. So like where they would fold the hat. And so we were able to find and tell that story. And I think just building that connection, that people were like, where is this? What? Where was this? Why is this not on exhibit all the time? So that's just one example. And I think what my initial presentation was just like a case study of what we're doing here at Children's Mercy, because that's what I can speak to. But the idea that we are in an institution that is beloved usually by the region. So we already have that buy-in. People love the institution, a lot of respect for the institution. And we need to tell that history a little bit more, because even just that rich history will get that buy-in even stronger.
It's really good when you're already sort of well established and like you said, beloved. That's a sort of impressive way to describe an institution, even a children's hospital. And so that's great to hear. Johanna, let me ask you this, and this is sort of something that you mentioned early on, where you said that you shared some of the research that you had been working on that had yet to be published with the journalists for them to do this week-long series. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what that was like for you. And I mean, obviously you wanted to be able to use this as original research for your own publications, but could you talk a little bit about the decision-making process maybe and sort of the steps that you took to make a really, really big decision? And
Yeah, I have to say, I partly did that because writing the first book, and particularly the chapter on eugenic sterilization, basically meant for me reading 7,000 summaries of sterilization petitions. And they were really it was hard emotionally to do that because these are one story after another of poor health and poverty and alcoholism and all kinds of problems that the sterilization victims had that led them down to the route of eugenic sterilization. And the reason that I felt like this needed to be discussed on a broader base was that I knew that only historians were going to read my book. And when I read these petitions, I always felt like people were asking for a public acknowledgement of what the state had done to them. And this was the way to bring the story to the public in a way that I felt almost viscerally that I owed my subjects that kind of acknowledgement. And so the decision to do that was super easy. What was complicated was that I then basically asked the university lawyers for guidance and help, as did the journalists with their lawyers. And so it became a negotiation between the legal team from the Winston-Salem Journal and the legal team from the University of Iowa, which is where I was at the time. And the more these legal teams negotiated with each other, the more complicated it became and the clearer it became we were never going to get anywhere. So at some point, the journalists and I basically just ditched them and said, we're just going to do this on our own, and we're just going to ignore what all of these legal teams are saying. And the one thing that I had asked him was that I basically shared primary sources from these sterilization petition summaries with them. So I asked them, to respect the privacy, of course, of the sterilization victims. And then after they were done with the reporting, I wanted them to destroy the copies that they had made. And this was really a good faith agreement. So there was no way I could control whether this was going to happen. But I basically felt that the sharing of these stories was so incredibly important that I needed to do it. I think if I were in that situation again, I wouldn't even try to get legal counsel. That didn't seem to be going anywhere. And, that is, of course, what happens when you have one institution and another institution trying to protect themselves.
So, I mean, you're really kind of talking about sort of being like the conduit, like between your historical subjects and really their kind of mission, which kind of, I want to just say, I mean, that kind of, I mean, it raises some questions about how long you could do sort of work like this. To what extent is there a half-life in terms of doing work that is this kind of emotionally charged?
I feel like, especially
although clearly you have been, not shy.
I was going to just go where I was going to go.
And for those who haven't seen the Garrison lecture, I mean, yeah, like when it comes available, you should certainly take a look at this. But I mean, like you're talking about some very emotionally difficult work. And I'm guessing just like what is the place from which you sort of draw some sense, how do you manage that emotional like burden?
I have learned to be able to eventually distance myself emotionally from the analytic academic thing that I'm doing there in order to write this. But you're right. I mean, I found it very difficult when I was reading these sterilization summaries, and I was just spent a week reading on anesthetized pain in prematures, and I was exactly back at that point, right? It's a downer to underemphasize what it really is. It's very difficult to do. But I do also find that the more I engage in it, the more I'm able to distance myself I don't think I could do it if I weren't able to do it that way. And ultimately, I find finding a constructive way to analyze and write about it so important that I need to engage in it. So I don't know, they kind of go hand in hand. I can't exactly explain to you how I do it, although I do have to say I suspect that my unwillingness to engage and volunteer in political work about the topic that I'm researching, or at least to limit it to some point, might have to do with that. But that's also not quite true, because I did engage in the political work when we were doing the restitution payment discussions. And I will re-engage clinicians when I'm further along in the neonatal intensive care unit space, because I think, again, it's super important that people know this history and that they understand how we make these medical ethical decisions. So yeah, maybe that's where the pickleball comes in, and the having a dog and going on a walk and taking a break, and which I get better at the older I get.
There is an element of cynicism, but there's also an element of, I think it sounds like, hope as well, which is to say that you see that the work that you're doing and envision it having the potential to make this sort of transformative impact. And that's why, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's sort of why you feel like it needs to be known, right?
Yes.
It needs to be shared, right?
Yes.
So,
and I think it needs to be shared with more than clinicians who are going to be hostile to you. I mean, one of the things that I really find interesting now that I work on this NICU piece is when I was writing the book about the history of abortion, I was basically dealing with clinicians whose work I admired. You know, they were going out there and they were doing all this work in order to make reproductive health care and abortion accessible to women, and, you know, often risking their livelihood and their lives. And now that I'm talking about the kind of clinical care in the neonatal intensive care units, I'm sure it's better today, but the history is not pretty. And so I expect that in the clinical spaces that have to do with neonatal intensive care clinicians, that yes, some people will recognize what I say and will find it important, and some people will find themselves unduly criticized. But, you know, there too, I think it's super important, again, that we bring this history both to clinicians and that we bring it to parents who need to understand what the questions are, what the medical ethics questions are, for instance, that they need to engage in, and that it is important in the patient advocacy work that they're political. And so, insofar as patient and caregiver advocacy at Sloan Kettering illustrated to me how important it is to be political and aware, that I'm taking into the NICU space.
That's really just kind of incredible work, Johanna. And I think that's, I mean, sort of meaningful on so many levels. And I just want to, you know, thank our panel for doing such a tremendous job in contributing to this effort of History of Medicine Week and to addressing these really basic and kind of fundamental questions about how we sort of employ history and how we use it in more meaningful ways and reach more broader audiences in meaningful and transformative ways. So thank you all for your efforts here today. If we were in person, I would say everybody give our panelists a hand, and to the extent that we can do that even virtually, I'll say go ahead and do that at home.